This is my dad. He's rather Italian, and I'm going to use that one character trait about him to make him a gift. I'm Nicole, and welcome back to When Geeks Craft. Normally, we make maps that are based on something geeky, but my dad is a geek for one thing and one thing only, Star Trek, and I've already made him something from that, so Italy it is. I based this map off of a cool old map I found online. I brought it into my iPad to draw out the layers, and then I used something new. A tool called WonderDraft that is used often for D&D maps to draw the mountains for me. WonderDraft allows me to bring in my image and randomly draw pre-generated mountains on them. It legit cut over half the time it takes me to draw mountains by hand. From there, like always, I pulled the files into Inkscape, made them all into vectors by tracing to bitmap, and layered out my pieces nicely so the glowforge can understand them. Since they are vectors though, and a little too complex for the glowforge to process, I only bring in one layer at a time to help the machine's smooth cloud-based brain run a little bit smoother. After each piece is laser engraved and cut out, I bring them over to the workbench and start gluing. I start by attaching the back board and the main landmass boards together, using the Chicago screws as a guide. Once it's all attached, I use the cutoffs as a template to glue in the islands to the right spots. I often get asked how I seal my edges for resin. The answer is a lot of CA glue. Once the landmasses are in place, I run a bead of glue around every seam to make sure that the resin can't seep out. With all of that done, it's time to try something completely new: watercolors on wood. The wood I used is the same wood I used in the Skyrim map. Craft Closet's 1/4 inch thick unfinished cherry plywood. The stuff is amazing in the glowforge and it is great when you want to finish it in a very particular way. In my case, for this project, I wanted to try to use watercolors to dye the wood before sealing it. I have to say, I'm super happy with how it worked out. It turned out way better than I honestly expected it to and really allowed the wood grain to stay prominently in the background. With all the watercolor on the map, I finished it off with a few layers of clear spray paint. Now it's time for resin. With the reference image of the map I was working from, I went shopping at the pigment wall to find the right combinations of colors for the water. I wanted a more toned down blue than I normally do for these maps, so I went with a light blue, a light green, and a white. Now I always attempt to use a resin calculator before measuring out my resin, but it's sometimes really complicated to approximate these resin amounts in these obscure shapes. I'll leave a link to the calculator on Alumilite's website that I prefer to use, but on this one, I ended up with a lot more resin than I needed. I'm an artist, not a math person. I mixed the colors until I got something close to what I liked. I even had to add a little bit brighter blue into the mix to try to make sure that the blue tint that I wanted stayed there. With all of it finally mixed, I poured it all in. I used a syringe first to get in all those little nooks and crannies, and then I dumped in my ocean. For the next 2 hours, every 20 minutes, I would come in and swirl the resin until it was too tacky for me to move it around anymore. I'd use the heat gun to pop any bubbles, but I wanted to make sure I maintained those tight water spirals you see me making. And the only way to do that is to swirl the resin often until the pigment can't move freely anymore. Last but not least was to get the top layers attached. I removed the masking tape from the acrylic panel with a scraper tool and some Gorilla Tape. People often ask why I engrave the acrylic panel on backwards on my maps. The short answer is, it's a personal preference because I believe it just looks nicer. With it engraved in reverse, the front will always maintain that flat, shiny finish and can be easily cleaned. Here's my favorite part of every map, the peel. That first look you get of the acrylic panel on top of the resin map, so good. Looks good.
Oh yeah.
It's a real place. That's weird. I don't do real places. With all that done, I top it off with some adhesive-backed unfinished veneer pieces that I finished with a matte polyurethane. Let's take a look at the final shots. I want to give a huge shout out to our Patreon members. It's been a little bit since we've done a map, so I hope you don't mind us coming back with a map of a real place and not a fictional place. If you have any suggestions for future projects, be sure to leave them in the comments below. We take suggestions very seriously and want to make things that you guys want to see. The files for this map, as well as every other project you've ever seen on this channel, are available for download on our Patreon page. Link is in the description below. Thanks so much, guys. See you next time.